Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from our various still quarantine zones. We're actually still doing that because we were still in the middle of a fierce pandemic that this absolute schmuck that runs this country has helped make infinitely worse than it needed to be. I'm Michael Brooks, along with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Theoretician and economist in residence, David Griscom.
How's it going?
It's going well on this week's program. Madina Toure, she's an education reporter for Politico, and we're talking about what does it actually mean? Bill de Blasio has belatedly and radically insufficiently, but to some tiny degree, responded to the democratic uprisings that have taken place in New York City and across the country and globe around police violence, racism, murder, and in fact, budget priorities. He's saying that he's going to cut the NYPD, which has a $6 billion budget, a little bit, redirected into education to some extent. Well, what does that exactly mean? We're going to be talking about the numbers and the budgets with the great reporter Madina Toure, and then an icon of public intellectualism, linguistics, and resistance, Noam Chomsky. We just recorded this conversation about an hour and a half ago. He supports free speech substantively and across the board, folks. We're talking about that. We're also talking about his perception of the autonomous zone in Seattle, the uprisings, as well as Lula, Brazil, Trump, the fate of the earth, and more. You'll hear the first part of it in the main show and the second part of it in the post game for TMBS patrons. And of course, we've got a gem with David Griscom. We've got a ton of stuff to get to in the postgame. In addition to the second half of the Chomsky video interview, Daniel Bessner is going to be here. We're going to talk about the relationship between the Pentagon, Hollywood, and policing, how those propaganda matrix work. AMLO, courageous. He'll help send fuel supplies to Venezuela, countervailing vicious U.S. sanctions regimens. We're talking about that. Alarming, terrifying, a border skirmish, which has reportedly left 20 Indian troops dead over disputed territory between India and China. They fought a war over this in 1962. We'll focus on that in the postgame. Tony Blair wants a new form of biometric identification as the biopolitics out of Corona are terrifying. We'll talk about that, as well as Bill Burr chillaxing Joe Rogan, and a whole bunch more, the usual. And we don't usually do this. We might even do this in the main show. I'm pretty bored in general by these clips these days and this kind of content, but Charlie Kirk just said some legitimately funny stuff. And I think we're going to do basically like a little bit of like a philosophy history lesson out of it. So I'm excited to that. We'll actually probably do that. We might do that maybe in the main show. We're going to have, as I say, the first half of Chomsky, probably, if you're watching this, probably a little bit around 8:10, 8:15 or so. But first, we've got to talk about our country's meatpacking plants, Tyson Foods, labor resistance, and another in the endless stories of the acceleration of COVID-19 because of the Trump administration and because of corporate America. Now, let's be very clear about this. Meatpacking plants are super spreaders of the virus. Counties that house meatpacking facilities have higher infection rates than New York City, which has, of course, been brutally hit by the virus due to the violent, horrific incompetence led by Donald Trump and very much amplified by Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio. 15 meatpacking counties now report a higher infection rate on a per capita basis than New York City, the virus's epicenter. This May, in a meat plant in Iowa, over 700 employees, that's 58% of the workforce, tested positive for COVID. Workers are packed closely together. They cannot practice social distancing and maintain the high rates of production and ruthless productivity standards imposed by these meatpacking companies. Tyson Foods, one of the lead villains in our country, one of the most sort of brutal exemplifiers of modern Fordism, was slow to enact and implement even the most small and modest of protections, let alone making any fundamental changes to protect workers' health. After months of fighting for better conditions and production slowdowns, workers have begun resorting to absenteeism. Between 30 and 50% of meatpacking employees, according to the UFCW, United Food and Commercial Workers International Union, numbers. Let's talk about what meatpacking actually looks like. And there's a reason why, from the systemic and up-tempo and absolutely ruthless rate of exploitation of labor, as well as the dire ecological consequences and horrific abusive treatment of animals, that the animal industry, the agriculture industry, has fought so vigorously in Congress in an attempt to keep its industry in the shadows and block investigative reporting and exposure. To process chickens at the Tyson rate of demand, it is simply impossible for workers to be safe and practice social distancing. Tyson has put up some protections like screen dividers on the line, but the nature of the work itself requires workers standing closely together. The corporation has ratcheted up production and fought against any changes, and has helped by the Trump administration in resisting any slowing of production and any fundamental changes to the speed of this process. ProPublica reports the lack of meatpacking corporations showed to the lack of care the meatpacking corporation showed to the community and their workers. Smithfield Foods chief executive Kenneth Sullivan sent a letter to Nebraska Governor Pete Ricketts calling social distancing, quote, a nicety that makes sense only for people who work with laptops. At some facilities, and of course, Smithfield Foods is the conglomerate behind Tyson, as an example, behind Tyson. And some facilities, like in North Carolina, Tyson began doing private testing and started suppressing the information that reached local health directors. As health officials around the country began demanding higher standards from Tyson and meatpacking companies, Donald Trump got involved to fight against protecting workers' health. Trump administration put forward executive order requiring meatpacking facilities to stay open, making the job of health and labor officials to implement safety measures much more difficult. Not only does the Trump order mean that workers continue to work in unsafe conditions, but it could also very likely be used as a legal justification to block future lawsuits brought by workers against the employers who have damaged and risked their health. OSHA has a history of complaints against Tyson. In 2017, the Government Accountability Office reported that workers at meatpacking facilities are unlikely to contact OSHA about complaints because of fear of retaliation from these companies. Even simple requests like bathroom usage are often denied on the floor. In the past, workers have reported to having to wear diapers. The danger of these jobs are immense as well. Meatpacking workers face fatality and injury rates higher than workers at sawmills, oil and gas, and construction. The pay is low, with workers only making about $12 an hour. The ecological costs are also enormous. In 2017, JPS, Cargill, and Tyson emitted more greenhouse gases than France. Water waste, feed production, and transportation are lead cases in environmental damage caused by companies like Tyson. The major meat producers have had the ear of politicians across the country, allowing them to exploit their workers while eluding basic labor standards. Conditions at these facilities have been bad, horrific, and damaging for a long time. The COVID crisis has only increased what was already enormously damaging to workers and the country as a whole. These are real essential workers to our society, and they deserve, along with all other workers, dignity, safety, democracy, power, and fair pay. Anything you guys want to add? Yeah.
I mean, I would just add that this is another great example of how Donald Trump is really amplifying and increasing the amount of exploitation that happens. The executive order that he put forward really could be used as an argument to protect these companies like Tyson from being sued in the future, right? Because the argument is like, well, the government saw these were essential services, so any kind of abuse that happened was necessary. Basically, and that's going to be, a massive problem going forward for a long time too. Not only is there the ecological question, but just the areas that a lot of the meat production in this country is done is in these rural areas that are very much cut off from, major cities. So people don't really realize the amount of exploitations that, workers face. And as, you noted, it's very low paid work in the first place. So yeah, and it's been really alarming over the past few months too, to see how serious the spread of COVID has been in these places, and the simple fact that it could be mitigated if these corporations were willing to take a hit to their profits, but instead they've just wanted to continue producing an unsustainable amount of meat for the circumstance, for the moment, right? This is something where having a private economy is very dangerous, because this is not a moment where the profit motive should be in charge, especially at a time when the public safety, the health of these workers is in jeopardy, and then the health of the larger public is in jeopardy. Because it's not just that these workers are contracting COVID, they're going home and then it's getting spread to people in their communities as well, which is another reason that rural America has been hit really hard with the coronavirus too. This kind of exploitation, it cascades all the way throughout our society, and we shouldn't be leaving these decisions in the hands of a few assholes, as you noted, the executive officer saying that that social distancing is only for people who work on laptops. I mean, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and probably the worst indicator I've seen, one of the more foreboding ones, is how many. I mean, what maybe it wasn't a lot of people, but I saw sentiment on Facebook and online of the insinuations about what type of people work at those plants instead of, and I don't know, I hope our country's beyond, collapsing into that sort of thing instead of, talking about the type of abuse that the bosses. I mean, we should have this story down by now. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle over 100 years ago.
Right. Exactly. And the kind of people who feed you every day, honestly.
Who could care not a whit if you live or die or spend an extra second with your family. I think, this actually reminds me of the conversation, one of the great conversations we have with Dustin Guastella, who hopefully will be on the show again in July. And we were talking, the material reality of, right-wing populism versus the left. And, among the many reasons, obviously the moral objections, that we fight for the humanity, the recognition, and full rights of migrants, as an example, is also strategic. It's absolutely the right thing to do. It's also strategic. I mean, if you even have a remote conversation, whether it's some type of disgusting class identity politics about someone who might work in a meat packing, or whether it's racism or demonizing of immigrant populations who are very represented in these jobs, you are, again, yes, it's the wrong thing to do, of course, but you're also effing yourself because you're dividing the potential of a base that you absolutely are going to be a part of, most likely. And certainly if you work in any type of service industry and, already basically don't hold wealth. So, at the end of the day, unionism is essential, and unionism is, predicated on, the democratic openness to work across boundaries. And again, as I always say, it doesn't govern, people can have whatever beliefs, social practices, create community how they like or not or whatever. But in the realm of politics, in the realm of going out and fighting those struggles against a place like Tyson, that requires all workers, and any divisiveness around that is a psyop. It's the boss.
Oh yeah.
And that's it. All right, let's talk a little bit about becoming a patron, and then we will get to our great guest, Medina Toure. So every Sunday, $8 patrons get the post game, which is very in depth. We have a lot of fun. We cover a lot of stories, and we have great additional guests that are regulars like Artesia Balthrop, Joshua Kahn Russell, Ben Burgess, Daniel Bessner. And then you get a Sunday episode, like as an example, we're in the middle of a 2-part history of modern Pakistan, how that relates to the CIA fueled Mujahideen war, as an example, in the 1980s. We just have done, at this point, I think it's over 702 episodes. So there's just a huge amount of really rich, really well-produced and excellent content. When you're a $21 and above patron, primarily what you're doing is everybody, because this show relies on you 100%. And so, you're foundational for people at that Patreon level. And you're also the reason that we're able to do video versions of some of the docs, which are awesome. And they always get released to $21 and above patrons first. And then after about a couple of weeks, we open them up and put them on our YouTube channel. And you can watch all of our illicit histories on the YouTube channel, from Brazil to Patrice Lumumba to why the United States doesn't have universal health care, Medicaid and segregation with Jamila Michener, and more recent ones on the RAND Corporation, Thomas Sankara. These are all excellent. It's incredible work by Vic Viana, Forrest Miller. And this actually is going to be released for patrons this Friday. And this one is worked based off of our buddy, Harvey K., the great New Deal scholar. This goes into the full extent of the full economic Bill of Rights that Roosevelt was pushing towards. And then also an introduction to somebody who I think we're going to do a full one, hopefully, on in the future, to the extraordinary work of A. Philip Randolph, who is, really a great American hero that many, many more people need to know. So we're going to play just a little teaser of this, and go to patreon.com/TMBS, become a patron today. If you're watching this, of course, you can hit the like button. If you want, you can hit us with a super chat. And we appreciate all of you.
In the 1930s, there had developed in the Midwest and the Plain States the Dust Bowl crisis. And if you didn't address soil erosion, you were going to have an environmental crisis, which did occur, but this was to restore conditions in a finer fashion. We launched the Rural Electrification Agency, something which is hardly ever talked about, but really did transform rural life for many hundreds of thousands of farmers. The big utilities, the privately held utilities, would not do that. They would not provide electricity to farmers because they figured it wouldn't be profitable enough.
Power company won't do it. But I hear there's a new kind of power. Go.
I love it. So go, and definitely, if you can, that's of course at the comrade and above level. Sometimes we do group calls as well, but really it's primarily, just the supporting all the great work that we do that we're really proud of. And then when you're at $8 level patron, you get every single piece of content. Go become a patron today, patreon.com/TMBS. We're going to take a brief break, and we will, or no, we don't do breaks now. What is it, Matt? Matt, you're muted.
I was saying we can't do breaks until my new internet comes.
We can't do breaks until the new internet comes. Do we have Medina Toure?
Not quite yet, but she should be here any second. So, here she is right now.
Okay, great. All right. Well, joining us, I guess, momentarily then is Medina Toure. There. Medina, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Everybody, Medina Toure is an education reporter covering New York City for Politico magazine. Medina, thanks so much for returning to the show.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Bill de Blasio has put forward in terms of an idea of cutting the NYPD a little bit and redirecting it into education. But before we get there, can you just give us like a broader budget picture? Like how much money goes into education in New York City? How much money goes to the police and so on?
Right. So, right now, first of all, thanks so much for having me. Right now is a really, really interesting times in terms of budget conversations. I mean, the Department of Education could see something like $262 million in cuts to their budget. I know that there's a lot of, concern about that. And the NYPD currently has this $6 billion budget. What the city council is proposing is to cut $1 billion from that. And this is really a response to all the protests that have been going on for the last few weeks. People have been calling for, for the NYPD's budget to be cut so that money could be used for other things like hiring social workers and guidance counselors. And so there's definitely been a big focus on that. So far, the mayor has said that, he said recently that he kind of made a commitment to shifting funding from the NYPD to youth initiatives and social services. He mentioned that he didn't really specify a specific amount yet. He said that's kind of being worked out right now in the budget process. He mentioned that there were going to be some town halls in like areas that have had high levels of police interactions with residents. And I think some cure violence providers are going to be participating in that. So that's a little bit about what's happening there.
So, and how explicit? So on the city council, it's getting a little bit more specific. They're talking about $1 billion, and are they being really clear too that they're not like, this isn't all of a sudden, hey, maybe $500 million is just going to go into like the rainy day fund or making cuts. Like, this is $1 billion. We have it, and we're going to redirect it materially to other socially productive things. Are they being really clear about that, at least in the city council?
Right. So far what they've said is that, so again, they want to cut $1 billion from the NYPD's upcoming budget. That amount represents something like 16% of their $6 billion budget. They've made, some proposals like slashing overtime costs across the board, removing the school safety division from the NYPD's purview, reducing the head count. They haven't really indicated, which agencies would benefit from the cuts. I know a lot of people are saying the Department of Education should be receiving that money. So it kind of remains to be seen where that's going to go exactly. But I do think it is worth noting that the council did, most of the council, with the exception of Councilmember Inez Barron, they did vote to increase the police force by over 1,000 cops. And I think a lot of activists like Josmar Trujillo from the Coalition to End Broken Windows have brought that up. And some have said, well, we should get back the money that went into that. So it does remain to be seen which agencies are going to benefit from those cuts, but definitely all eyes are on the Department of Education. And this there's been a lot of calls to hire more social workers, guidance counselors, school psychologists, so I think that's definitely one area that everyone's going to be watching.
When you talk about the council votes, can you give us a sense, as best you can? Obviously we don't, well, you might know some of the conversations that happen behind closed doors. You're a really good reporter. But in terms of like Inez Barron and I think it's Charles Barron is her husband's name. This is like a very distinct political couple in New York. They have serious political commitments, and they've both in terms of city politics and state politics have definitely for a very long time highlighted racism, gentrification, inequality, police violence. And so there is some connection there to, organic movements and protests that have moved across the city and are still ongoing. When you look at the kind of rest of the council, and I guess up through the mayor, of this kind of interesting dynamic where there's a lot of desire to hop on board with different trendy kind of discourses, but maybe the voting record doesn't match that. And also there might be a much more just taking de Blasio himself, and I'm trying to be careful here because this is such an opinion-driven show, but I'm trying to take it out of the realm of opinion. But there's been a lot of very interesting writing on particularly recently, there's a piece in Jacobin about how sort of even when he agrees with activists, he doesn't like that they're doing what they're doing. And I'm wondering, whatever it may be. And I'm wondering when you look at the kind of contradictions, with the exception of Inez Barron on the city council, like, how are they filtering that to the press? Like, how are they saying, yeah, we were voting for all this stuff, but now this is happening. So is it people are out taking enormous risks, so we're listening? Or is it, hey, this was actually always really our position?
Right. I know. I definitely think it's a good question. And that's why I mentioned that before. I mean, I think one thing that continues to be striking, and I mentioned like activists like Joe Smart Trujillo from the Coalition to End Broken Windows, who keep mentioning that. And even at the time when they did it, he was among people who was criticizing that. It is striking that, most of the council, with the exception of Councilmember Inez Barron, did vote to increase the force. I do remember at one point being at a forum on broken windows where some activists had kind of taken elected officials to task over that. And they were saying, well, there were certain things we were promised that didn't happen. And, we did this because of X, Y, Z. I think it seems to me now like a lot of these elected officials are responding to the moment. I mean, I think the protests have been they've been going on for weeks, and people have been going out all over the city. And, it's gotten to the point where people realize that they do have to respond because of the actions of protesters. I know that the chair of the city council's education committee, Mark Traeger, and Donovan Richards, who heads the public safety committee, they kind of put out a statement recently saying that they want to see the school safety agents removed from the purview of the NYPD. And that was interesting. There's some council members, I think Vanessa Gibson and Corey Johnson, some others who also, they were the ones who announced the $1 billion in cuts, the proposal to make that cut to the NYPD budget. I think a lot of them are kind of responding to what's happening out in the streets. But there are council members who are more on the conservative side, and not even just the ones who are Republican. There is kind of a group of conservative Democrats in the city council who are not as, probably don't have the position of like, get the cops out of the schools and like cut the NYPD budget. So there's a little bit of nuance there. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. But I think a lot of these elected officials respond to the moment, and even what you're seeing with the current and former staffers for the mayor who are going out and protesting, and who wrote this open letter. I think it's just a sign that like something I think even though this has happened before, I think Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, all of that happening has kind of changed the dynamic, and all of that happening with the pandemic, disproportionately impacting Black and Latinx communities, all that coming together has kind of changed things. And even some former top de Blasio staffers like Rich Breary and Maya Wiley also kind of speaking out about this issue of changing, the role that school safety agents play in schools. So I think across the board, and even the mayor, I mean, he hasn't given a specific dollar figure, and he has said that he thinks school safety agents should still remain under the NYPD, but he did commit to shifting the funding. I think the chancellor, I was listening to a town hall that the chancellor was having with Community Education Council 14 in Brooklyn yesterday, and somebody asked him about that, like, do you support, changing the role of school safety agents, divesting.
Sorry, what are school safety agents? What does that mean?
Right. So school safety agents, these are the officers that are in the schools.
And these are NYPD fully, like... Yes,
they're all under the purview of the NYPD. Yep. And so basically they're the people, like, the security guards, the people who like check the students in, who are at the doors and everything. And so, and I mean, I think, to kind of expand upon that, there have been calls to get school safety agents out of the schools for a while, but I think, of course, with everything that has happened, those conversations are being reignited. There's some people who are saying take them out completely. Some people say just reduce them, and some people are saying, well, why should this be under the purview of the NYPD? There are certain issues that should be handled by social workers, by guidance counselors, by school psychologists. So there's been a really interesting conversation there. It seems like the mayor wants to keep things in their current form. The chancellor at the town hall I mentioned yesterday, he was saying that he's currently, he didn't take a position, but he did say that he's, studying the issue, how it came to be that school safety agents, became under the purview of the NYPD. So there's a lot of interesting conversations that are happening across the board.
What about the more like, I mean, is there interest in the council on some of the I guess broader questions too? Like I want to be really careful now with details, but San Francisco has announced that they're going to start experimenting with the response programs, so that one of many criticisms has been, like a really basic technical thing. Like, why is it that if somebody is having, an emotional or mental issue, why is that a police response? Like, what, why? And so in San Francisco has announced some notion of shifting that a little bit. Is there interest in the council on some of those kind of wider demands?
As far as I've heard, it seems to me like a lot of the focus has been on cutting the budget and using that funding to hire more social workers, guidance counselors, school psychologists. But it has been interesting to see what's been happening in other places like Minneapolis, and just, the whole conversation there, the council members who want to disband the police department, the schools, ending their contract with the police department. I do think that there are people who want to see something similar happen here in New York. So I think it'll be interesting to see moving forward, what kinds of things they propose.
Yeah, and I want to add, everybody should watch. We interviewed Councilwoman Shama Sawant on the Jacobin show on Saturday that Ann and I host. And I mean, she's really she's actually expressed a lot of skepticism about the idea of having a study that goes on for a year and then mothballing it. And she's in the process right now of, as an example, taking away tear gas from the force. That's something that she's fighting on. So there's a lot of other areas it can go besides some budget cuts. What do educators, especially now where there's so much question just even about the idea of the safety of reopening schools for educators, for staff, for children. What is your sense, I guess, in terms of the budget priorities questions and everything else? The teachers want NYPD in the schools. What's your kind of sense of where teachers fit in this whole conversation?
Right. So actually, I did, maybe this was like a weekend or two ago, I did actually go to a march. It was basically a march of parents and students and advocates and educators who were calling for police-free schools. They actually marched from the headquarters of the United Federation of Teachers, the city's teachers union, up to Tweed Courthouse, the DOE's building. And it was, in the beginning, it was a small crowd, when they were people were speaking, but the crowd started to grow more and more. And at one point, it seemed like there were hundreds of people there, and there were students, there were parents, and there were teachers who were speaking. And, a lot of them, some of them were actually kind of taking aim at the United Federation of Teachers leadership and saying, oh, well, you guys need to do more to support Black Lives Matter Week. And, your statement on George Floyd was insufficient. And there was a real, I really got a sense from that particular event that there was a real desire to see police-free schools, to see some changes, to see more social workers, guidance counselors, school psychologists. I know that there's a little bit of variation, as I mentioned before. I'm sure there's some people who are they may not want to see police taken out completely. They might want to just see their role reduced. Sure, there are people who still think police should be there, but that maybe there should be more I don't know, a bit more communication between the school safety agents and the students. But there's definitely a lot of momentum for this across the board. It was a pretty diverse crowd from what I saw. I think people definitely want to see some changes in that regard. And in terms of curriculum too, I think even for myself, I know I did a story recently where I kind of talked to students and former de Blasio officials and advocates about this very issue of police in schools. But I did also talk to him about curriculum, and people want to see more. They want this to there's the whole issue of police killing of Black citizens, other people. They want to see that taught in school as well. They want students to learn about this. Like some students even talked to me about having a whole class devoted to it, a class about human rights issues specifically in the United States. So I definitely think a lot of teachers are interested in seeing more being done, not just about the school safety agents, but just about curriculum for students to learn about this and about the history of different communities.
What about that surge specifically in student activism?
I'm sorry?
What about the surge? I'm sorry. What about the surge specifically of student activism?
Oh,
like the role that students are playing in it?
Oh, yeah. And it's a good question. And I think students are definitely at the forefront of this. There has been, I mean, I guess student activism is something that has always been present in history. But I think kind of speaking specifically about recent events, yeah, I mean, I think, they've been calling for police to be out of schools or to be reduced for a long time. The student activists have been vocal on other issues too, like school integration and, this issue of discrimination in admissions process, schools that screen for students. I think across the board, we've been seeing students going out and protesting, holding sit-ins over racism and discrimination happening in their schools. And on this issue, yeah, I mean, there were so many students at that particular march. I interviewed some of them, and actually one of them, her name was Rain Hawkins. She is a student at the James Baldwin School, a transfer school in a transfer high school in Manhattan. And I talked to her before the march, and she was saying that, at the end of the day, this is an issue that affects us everyday people, not elected officials. We're the ones that make this city run. We have to have a say in where what the money is being used for, where the funding is going. So I think students are definitely at the forefront of this. And even the advocates I've spoken with have said that as well. And they're very plugged into this. The students I interviewed for my story, some of them are like, well, my parents aren't allowing me to go out to the protest, but I've been calling elected officials. I've been phone banking. I've been telling them to get on board with repealing 50A and support this, chokehold bill. So they also said, well, we're sharing videos of what's occurring on the ground. So across the board, students have definitely been leading these conversations.
Absolutely. So in the final couple of minutes, I mean, just could you actually tell us, I think it's related, it's a little off topic, but the state of like pushing to reopen the New York schools and basically how people feel about it and, the safety of those affected?
Yeah. So that is a big major conversation that's underway. The city has a bunch of different task force, sector advisory councils that are advising the city on different aspects of reopening. There's one for schools. There has to be at least 40 or 50 people on the one for schools. And there's like advocates and education leaders, higher education leaders, all sorts of individuals on it. They've had a couple meetings. There's been a lot of interesting developments on that recently. I mean, basically, the city says that it's considering a variety of options. It could be, plexiglass barriers. It could be there may be some form of remote learning because there's kind of a mixture of responses from families. Some families are like, well, even if schools reopen in September, I'm not sending my kid because it's not going to be safe. Other families are like, oh, well, I need my kid to be in person or else I can't go back to work. So there may be a mixture of in-person and then there's also the factor of like class size has to be limited. Some schools are overcrowded. There are a lot of different options that are being considered, but I think people are kind of, putting pressure on the city and saying, we don't want what happened with the whole situation around the closing of the schools for remote learning. We don't want to see a repeat of that. There was a feeling that the school system should have been closed sooner, although some were saying, well, a lot of kids rely on these schools for basic needs. So I think there's definitely a lot that's underway. I think the chancellor had, at that town hall that I was listening to yesterday, he was saying that, well, they want to be guided by health expert decisions and guidance, and they want to be, anything can happen between now and September, so they kind of want to be careful and just look at the different varying needs. I think they put out a survey to hear from families. So there's a lot of different things to balance. And I know that UFT is involved with that as well, because there's a question of teachers and how they're going to be paid. And so there's definitely a lot that's underway. But I know that there's a lot of anxiety because different families have different situations. And like, even another teacher I spoke to was just like, well, you know, for those of us who have big schools, like large classes, like how are we going to do this? You know, so it's going to be interesting to see how that pans out.
Final question. Is it, I mean, I'm obviously with my politics very concerned about, you know, Bill Gates and Eric Schmidt and all of that sort of Andrew Cuomo stuff that he's talking about in terms of the education system as a whole. Has there been, on the other hand, any thought that when you see these problems arise, like kids can't get food because the schools are shut down because of a pandemic, or there isn't the same access to technology if there's remote learning, has there been any sense of, you know, just more broadly, like when you have such a limited social safety net, the burden that falls on the schools, and some thinking of like, hey, if we're going to have, you know, proper preparedness, there has to be, as an example, like other ways to get food to people and taking care of kids. Has there been any thought in that direction?
Yeah, that's actually something that, you know, someone, I had spoken with someone from an immigrant advocacy group who had mentioned that, like, this question of accommodating families who have those needs, and even things like after school and working with community-based organizations. I'm not sure what the city has determined yet in that particular area, but I do think it's something that a lot of people are thinking about. Is like, when schools reopen, like, you know, the city is going to have to come up with some alternatives to address those needs, and maybe team up with certain organizations to deal with that.
Medina Toure, I really appreciate your time. As always, follow all of Medina's work on
Thank you
Politico.
so much for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right. Take care. Be well. All right, guys. We're not taking breaks. I'm still getting used to not taking breaks. So let's, what we're going to do is I want to do this Charlie Kirk thing. If we could bring that to the main show, because it's hilarious. And then I want you to do your gem, and then we're going to get to the good Dr. Chomsky.
Oh, hell yeah. So we want to do this Kirk thing?
Yeah, let's do this Kirk thing. So I'm pretty, and I think the super chats are open. I saw somebody question if there's a problem with giving super chats, but I don't think so.
Yeah, we got Erica said testing 1 2 3 with $10. So I hope that was a good test.
Yeah,
Erica.
go keep testing, guys. Keep testing away. Okay, I made no secret that I'm kind of like, I don't know. I'm just like, whatever. I can't spend my life making fun of right-wing assholes. I mean, it's part of it. And the humor quotient, even on Ruben, guys, I got to be honest. I feel like a dream.
Ruben peaked that time he was walking around after his shake. Like he's never
going to be that funny. And
if we do Ruben again, we should just revisit that video and just watch the rest of it, actually, because that was peak Ruben.
That video happened. You know what? Like, I was on a 10-day silent meditation retreat. So I came out and watched that video, and because of the mind, like, I found it actually upsetting to watch. like that level of like,
I'm having a beautiful day.
So delusional and like,
you know what that
so
was?
upset and just it was like just a minefield of unskillful habits.
You remember what happened that day, right? That was the day Colette said he was like a loser or something like that.
Yeah, that was when Colette, when they were all trying to cut bait with the guy. His grievance about that was kind of legit, because it was like, wait a second, like everybody comes on my show while I stare into blank space and act like a fucking moron, but now all of a sudden it's fashionable to call me stupid. Screw you guys.
Yeah, now that you've taken all the money out of my subscribers' pockets,
I'm oh my God. But This one really caught my attention. This is hysterical, and we haven't spent that much time talking about Charlie Kirk at all. Charlie Kirk is, of course, who funds Turning Points USA? Was that Foster Freeze?
Foster Freeze, yeah.
Okay, so Foster Freeze is an infamous reactionary oligarch. He did the infamous put an aspirin between your knees as birth control comment, I think back in 2011. Yeah. Funder of Rick Santorum and other, extreme far-right figures. And, Charlie somehow got to him and was just like, man, I'm at college and I had to hear who this guy Cesar Chavez was. I mean, it's just a disaster. And this is just funny. Like, I have to say, especially in my mood of, there's just a million legitimate criticisms of campus politics, frankly, like millions. And I feel like we end up having to delineate them on like the actual left because they undermine the actual left. And like, not only does Charlie Kirk, of course, not go there because at the end of the day, he's a, reactionary dope who wants to mythologize and naturalize, basically, in my view, every form of repression and exploitation imaginable. But it's like, what happened? You're going to watch this clip and I'm going to miss, like, what happened to Rush Limbaugh just being a fat fuck who was just an asshole? Like, what happened to, like, I don't need to read all that stuff. Ronald Reagan, Reader's Digest, and the Steelers. Like, just stop doing this shit. Stop pretending that you've read this stuff. Mm-hmm. Or do it if you're going to pretend like this, because it's pretty funny. Let's watch.
To have the opposition party go full Rousseauian Marxist. I'm so glad you mentioned Rousseau, because he was the gateway to Karl Marx. And Plato was really the gateway to Rousseau. And what the big conversation is...
You're well read, The Republic and so forth. Good.
Thank you. And Aristotle and Plato, who, of course, was the age-old student and teacher dynamic. Of course, Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. But Aristotle disagreed with Plato on one fundamental thing. He disagreed on a lot, which is private property a good thing or a bad thing? Plato said bad thing. Get rid of private property. Plato also argued against the nuclear family. Aristotle said, no, I think private property serves a role. I think that if you try to take people's stuff away, all of a sudden you're going to take away their meaning and their ability to pass on wealth and ideas to the next generation. Oh, this divide between Aristotle and Plato is playing out today in our politics.
Let me tell you something. If Aristotle was that easy to read, I would have done way better in Greek philosophy. I wish that when I was trying to find that, figure out the golden mean while I was, pulling an all-nighter, it was just like Aristotle, you cracked open. It was just like Plato was against ideas. Well, David, I admit, I did take Greek philosophy. We've all dabbled in this stuff. Do you see an unbroken line between somebody who agitated against Athenian democracy, literally wanted a small cadre of like kind of intellectually gifted elite to philosophically guide the polity? Do you see an unbroken chain between him and Rousseau, who was kind of a romantic? Yeah. And then Marx, who tried to, make the fight for socialism economic, scientific, whatever else you think. And was it even true? I don't recall, but you could absolutely know more than me. Did Plato oppose private property?
Well,
that one.
If I could, right? I want to start with the Greek stuff because it's like that's even funnier. I have to say.
Okay, please.
There was one property relation that Aristotle was very fond of, and that was the master-slave relation.
Yeah.
So you have to remember that when these people are invoking,
because you could pass ideas and things onto your kids. Exactly. As an example,
you could keep the ideas in other people's brains.
Yeah. You own the tutor and the farm worker, both of them, and you get them from dad.
But I mean, like the thing is with Kirk is that when he's like another one of these characters, almost like Steve Bannon, that when they throw away thinkers' names, it's almost meaningless, right? Because they're just like throwing buzzwords that make them seem more intelligent. Because like here's the thing: is like Plato did critique property, but very specifically for like the warrior class.
Right.
So like the idea is that the warriors shouldn't have property because their only goal should be defending the city, right? And the only people who like also, and then, you know, the people at the very top in the like philosopher king system, right? They didn't have private property either, but they also were like the universal rulers of the entire society.
They didn't have private property because like everything was their property in a certain sense.
So like the argument that like of Aristotle is ludicrous. I mean, it's
that's
it's
also
funny.
not the big split. That's
What?
not the big split. The split is, and I forget where, I'm sorry, but there's that famous painting where Plato's pointing to the sky and Aristotle's pointing to the ground, right? Mm-hmm. The split is...
There's a split over the forms.
Over forms, and basically that Aristotle was in some, you know, certain way was pivoting towards empiricism and natural observation, whereas Plato was saying that, you know, that everything existed on an ideas level, and that we could sort of just barely comprehend them because they existed. The perfect form of everything existed in pure abstraction, which doesn't necessarily sound super left wing.
Well, the other thing is that like the ideology of Plato and Aristotle, like the actual philosophy is complicated and it's very interesting. I spent a lot of time really searching through Plato for answers. I mean, he was a very inspiring thinker. And I highly, suggest reading all those dialogues. But it's Definitely. So funny to me how the right wing looks towards both Aristotle and Plato as like their tribunes, right? Literally, Aristotle, you ever heard the word aristocracy, right? Like literally systems of government that are the complete opposite of the so-called liberal democracy that, these organizations that Charlie Kirk works for are supposed to uphold, right? They literally were saying that we want a small group of elites, technocracy, to govern and control society. The only thing that I think is worthwhile in that clip is...
Foster Free's style policies, especially if you actually applied them to veterans, God forbid, would sort of mean that warriors wouldn't be able to own houses.
Yeah.
Like indirectly, because they wouldn't have the earning capacity.
But look, the thing is, like Plato was against the nuclear family. He wanted everyone to have these like massive sex parties where nobody knew who anyone's parents were. That's the fun kind of Greek tradition. And then I also think it's good that Kirk is quite scared of Rousseau. I think Rousseau, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago,
should be scared of Rousseau.
Yeah, quite the radical philosopher who is very important in demystifying a lot of these nonsense ideas that property relations are somehow natural, which again is not something that is argued explicitly in either of these Greek philosophers either, right? The idea is that like these are things that you can move around, that these aren't necessarily like these are government, like the government creates the property right. It's not something that's universal, how like they like to describe and think about property rights.
But just to not be too much of like a stickler, but I just have never, and people could know better than me, but I've just never heard that trajectory before.
What?
I've never heard somebody say that Plato, okay, sure. There's like the old, like, hey, it's Plato and everything else is like a footnote in Western philosophy. Yeah. Sure. Okay. Like obviously Plato and Aristotle, things flow in certain traditions from them, of course. But that's an interesting one. The idea that like Plato's directionality and Rousseau's directionality, like would be like an interesting book to write. Like that would be a novel argument and then somehow they both led to Marx. That would just be.
I know.
That's like you're opening up like a Wikipedia page and just basically telling us like, yeah, and then Cicero led to Meister Eckhart, and then that was what ended up being Mao.
No, Michael, he's a moron.
Think about it. Okay, thank you. I was just trying to simplify here.
What's their whole thing?
The moron?
Like these Charlie Kirk people, they say, well, the American system is based on, there's a very specific tradition that is missing from his definition of philosophy, the Judeo-Christian tradition of philosophy, right? So there's an entire, literally like around like 1,500, 2,000 years of philosophy that Charlie Kirk is skipping over to get to Rousseau, to tie Rousseau to Plato. In a tradition, by the way, that was highly influenced by Plato, and that Charlie Kirk argues is the basis for his worldview. So, I mean, it's completely ludicrous. It's cherry picking nonsense, obviously. It gets me mad as somebody who spent a lot of time, like, really like, oh, I got to understand these texts or work through them. And I'm not necessarily saying like I'm an expert. I don't have like a master's degree or a doctorate in any of these things, but, I spent a lot of time really fixating on these ideas to see how like flippant some moron like Charlie can be.
They need to approximate it, though. I think like there are enough suckers that are like, I need to get some actual brain food here. Tell me about Plato, Charlie.
Exactly.
And it's like, I can't remember. There was some like science writer or something like had a phrase nonsense on stilts. And it's like, it's one thing to, like you're saying, like humbly try to grapple with these things. It's not to be trot out there by Dennis Prager after you've been pumped like full of fracking dollars. And for like the last part of your 20s, probably not doing a whole lot of reading. I'm just going to go out and there and say, I don't think Charlie Kirk's probably doing the most amount of like deep reading.
Exactly.
I do want to say though, but I actually think though that this is, but yeah, I like that though, that, people out there who are interested in this stuff and trying to read and trying to think, that should be praised 100% and supported. And then, Charlie Kirk is
and welcome to us, because
come over here. We actually have read some of these things. We've actually read some of this shit, and of course, that is involved in that old teacher student. Is he doing like a Karate Kid thing when he does that? Like, I swear to God, I feel like I remember that from Karate Kid.
How would you make it less cringeworthy?
Plato and Rousseau. It's like fuck Miyagi. All right, David, what's the gem, brother? What's up? What's up? Let's do the gem, and then we'll get to the first half of our conversation with Noam Chomsky.
Yeah. Well, on another subject that our good comrade and friend Charlie Kirk has been getting wrong for, pretty much his whole existence, but specifically over the past couple of weeks, is this whole Trump recovery and the so-called, revival of the stock market and the Trump surge that we're seeing right now. Now, Gore Vidal has this really wonderful line where he called the United States of amnesia. And when it comes to the financial community, you really have to say that it counts like double, because we're going through another massive moment of like completely uncalculated and almost baseless exuberance that we've seen. So everyone's been talking a lot about how they've seen, the stock market, rise, and then it'll trickle back down and then rise again. And everyone's like, what's going on? And they're coming up with all these stories. Primarily Trump has been focusing on the fact that there were some good jobs numbers in the most recent job report, and the fact that retail sales were higher than expected from the last government statistics. Now, just really quick on the jobs numbers that everyone's fixated on. Let's not forget how many jobs were lost since this coronavirus crisis has started. I mean, we haven't seen anything on this scale, since the Great Depression. And even this most recent jobs report that everyone was fixated on, even the Bureau of even the government statistics have been saying that, like, we think that a lot of these might come from misclassifications, because a lot of people don't know how to classify their workers in the context of coronavirus, people who they've basically laid off, but they've said, when things get normal, we'll give you your job back. So a lot of those workers have been misclassified. And the EPI estimates that we're like the actual unemployment rate that we're seeing in the United States is like 19.7%, which is like historic, depression level crisis. And it's something that we're all experiencing and feeling around us, which is why people look, with such shock towards these stock market numbers. And, there's a couple of reasons why that's happening. And the first one, which is something that a lot of people understand now, but I think it's important that we understand that materially and not just as a slogan, is that, the stock market doesn't really measure the economy, right? The stock market is a way that people make money. And in some like traditional ways, it used to be a way to sort of was a good barometer of like the feelings of the bourgeoisie. And it used to be something that was based on a future claim to profits. It's completely divorced itself from that. Now, what this exuberance and this excitement that we're seeing from the class of people who buy and participate in the stock market is the reality that they've seen that the Federal Reserve will do whatever is needed to make sure that asset prices stay as high as possible. One, with all of this, the massive amounts of money that the Federal Reserve has pumped into financial markets initially, where could that money really go other than in the stock market, right? So of course people are going to be buying stocks with that money. Two, the Federal Reserve is now buying, corporate bonds, which is something it's never done before, and is a massive move. And you got to understand, one, that bonds aren't traditionally something that people jump into to make a lot of money off of, but over the past few weeks, they've become very much like hot commodities for folks. Bonds really, like, especially like the investment grade bonds, you buy them to hold for a really long time to just get a steady stream of income. But people are seeing massive returns on these corporate bonds, because the Federal Reserve basically is going to go up and keep those prices as high as possible. That market's really shifting. And you have to understand like how critical debt is in the U.S. economy. Something that I talked about a lot on the Gem for like the past 2 years, and a lot of people were saying, well, that's not a problem, how big the corporate debt load has gotten, but it's starting to really hit a crisis level. So I just wanted to share this from Adam Tooze real quick. So these are the rising share of companies with debt servicing costs that are higher than their profits. I mean, if you really look at that line, it's an alarming rate that certainly growed after the initial recession 2008, but has grown exponentially.
That's a fucking nightmare.
Yeah, but that's been the dynamic from the Federal Reserve's activity over the past 10 years to basically make it so easy to amass a significant amount of debt because they've kept interest rates so low. And now we basically have like a corporate economy that has just, is completely addicted to debt. And now the Federal Reserve is jumping into the bond market, which is not fundamentally changing that dynamic. We're in an ironic moment right now where the Federal Reserve Chair is demanding Congress, continue to do stimulus spending, which is not, it's not something that they've been pursuing. So here's the reality. There's two very different worlds. There's the world of the working class people, the people who get a paycheck, and that's how they, survive, and people who get all of their money from holding significant amounts of assets. And we've seen this massive institution, the Federal Reserve, step into becoming one of the most important players in the U.S. economy. By the way, something that has very little democratic oversight, by the way, and is functioning in a way to make sure that the super rich and the people who have access to the Federal Reserve programs are on a completely different footing. So there's a complete decoupling from the lived reality of people who produce in the society and the people who extract profits through holding assets. So, we might see these kind of jumps up on the stock market, over the next couple of months, but there is no way to look at the actual material conditions of this U.S. economy and say that it is anything that's stable. And I think even the stock market is going to have that realization over the next couple of months as you see these states that reopened and you see coronavirus cases spread in those communities, that a lot of those states are going to have to close down operations again. Because, we saw this retail growth recently, but that's just because a lot of states reopened. And now we're already seeing in states like Texas and in Florida, the coronavirus is spreading so much that there's going to have to be another likely round of lockdowns, or at least some kind of restrictions. But again, given the state of politics in this country, who really knows what the hell's going to happen there? But really, don't let anybody tell you that the economy is doing great, because we're looking at around 20% unemployment, largest amount of people pulling unemployment checks that has ever happened in U.S. history, and a massive viral pandemic that we still have no clear way out of. And we need to be sure that we're not listening to the people who led us into the crisis in 2008 now. You're muted, Michael.
You sound like you read Rousseau coming out of Plato, man.
Probably.
I couldn't sleep the other night. I rewatched Big Lebowski. And it is like an incredible movie. I was on a Coen Brothers kick. And Jeff Bridges, because I also watched True Grit, their version of True. It's an amazing, amazing movie. Thank you for Nando and Connor Kilpatrick were pushing me on that. I liked so much. I'm going to order the book.
You should
independent bookseller.
Watch Hell or High Water if
Hell or High Water is a fantastic movie, but I already saw that. I actually saw Hell or High Water twice. But the scene in Big Lebowski, I don't even remember the context of it, but there's one that Jeff Bridges is like, that's just like your opinion, man. It's just like the perfect, like, so almost everything you hear today, you know? It's like, I'm not gonna wear a fucking mask. It's just like your opinion, man. Just whatever. Anyways, we got a bunch to get to in the post game. Here's what we're gonna do, folks. We recorded this interview with Noam Chomsky about 2 hours ago. It was a great conversation. He actually definitely, gave us more of his time than anticipated, which is always nice when that happens. It's just I won't even mention her name, but there's another kind of, person sort of in the pantheon that I'm working on a little bit to see if perhaps she could be a guest. But, to me, obviously, Adolph Reed, primary intellectual influence on me, incredible hero, brilliant intellectual. Cornel West has meant a lot. Slavoj Žižek's meant a lot. And, Noam means a lot. And I think, it's even actually when I realized, some differences in worldview that are subtle, but it's just the guy has been fighting for this stuff for decades against the genocide in Vietnam, for everything from East Timor to Chile to and the pioneering. Manufacturing Consent is an incredible book. So Jesus Christ, I keep getting rings. Look, we're going to play the first half of the Noam Chomsky interview, and the second half you will watch in the post game. But let's get right to it. It was a great honor. Everybody enjoy it. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, very, very honored and happy to have him, is Professor Noam Chomsky, who has been a public intellectual, linguist, activist for decades, and is author of course, many books, including Manufacturing Consent, co-author of that book, big influence on me and this show. Most recently, he's author of Internationalism or Extinction, Universalizing Resistance. Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for being here.
Pleased to be with you.
Can you give us first your broad reaction to the uprisings that we've seen across the United States and in fact globally over the past couple of weeks, centered very specifically and initially on the police murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and then encompassing race, policing, capital, and so on. What are your thoughts as you look at these movements happening?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the absolutely unprecedented scope, scale of participation, engagement, and public support. If you take a look at polls, it's astonishing. The public support, both for Black Lives Matter and for the protests, is well beyond what it was, say, for Martin Luther King at the peak of his popularity at the time of the I Have a Dream speech. It's way beyond that. And that's it's also far beyond the level of reaction to earlier events. There were public reactions, strong ones, to many earlier police killings, but nothing like this. Maybe the most similar was the reaction to the beating of Rodney King, beat him almost to death, after the attackers were freed in the courts without charge. There was a week of protests. 60 people were killed. Had to call in federal troops to quell the protest. But it was in Los Angeles where it happened. Something elsewhere, nothing like this. No, it's everywhere. And it's not just the police killing, it's background issues. So it's beginning to move into concern inquiries and protests about the facts that lead to events like this occurring. Shows an enormous rise in consciousness, belated, but a rise in consciousness about 400 years of vicious repression, unremitting, leaving a very bitter legacy, deep issue in the whole socioeconomic and cultural order. I think the recognition of that and willingness to act on it is without any precedent that I know of.
What do you think accounts for the unprecedented nature of this?
I think it's the result of many years of intensive activism. We see it in many other ways. So, for example, a year or so ago, the New York Times ran an important series, highlighted an important series, 1619, on the history of racism in the United States, 1619, because that was the year when black slaves began coming in substantial numbers, scattered cases before, but it was from 1619. You couldn't have imagined that a few years ago. And that's one of many signs of what I hope are really significant changes that seem to be in the way which we attribute to the groups like Black Lives Matter and others who've been bringing these issues to public attention, making people think about them, learning what happened. The reaction right now, say, to Trump's Tulsa appearance, bringing up the hideous record of that. That's quite important. When you go back to, say, Ronald Reagan, when he opened his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a town which is known for owning one thing, the murder of 3 civil rights workers. The message was pretty plain, but there was very little reaction.
There's much more reaction now, and the parallels are quite stark there. It's very hard to get a grasp on something like this in terms of various types of reporting, misinformation, and so on. So we need to approach it gingerly. But as someone who has a rooting in some respects in the anarchist tradition, I think maybe in many respects, what is your thought on this autonomous zone that's arose in Seattle?
Well, it's one of a number of very interesting developments, in part reactions to the pandemic, in part reactions to this, creating structures of mutual support and cooperation that extricate themselves from the governmental structures, which have been shown to be completely inadequate in dealing with either particular problems like getting water to people in need, or fundamental problems of why we're so desperately unprepared for crises. The autonomous zone is an interesting case of this. Also striking to see the support. The mayor of Seattle support. Apparently plenty of popular support. It's driving Trump and Fox News insane, but that's a positive sign. So something important has happened. Again, what it'll lead to, you never know. But I think it's an important manifestation of the sense that we've got to take our lives under control, that we can't leave them in the hands of the authorities who declare themselves our masters. We have to take charge.
Is it important to reframe that a bit, that something can arise and may even result in quote unquote failure, but if there's information in it and if it expresses a certain impulse towards justice or and so on, that it doesn't need to be kind of linearly measured as a quote unquote success or failure?
Success and failure are complicated things. Any serious struggle is going to have moments of regression. Things don't work out the way you expected. So you pick up, you go on from there. Anyone you can think of, civil rights, women's movement, abolition, all of them. It's a process. And so take, say, the Sanders campaign. A lot of young people, I get letters all the time, see things posted, say, we tried, we lost, it's over, I'm getting out. It's not what happened. What happened was a tremendous success, unparalleled success. Nothing like this has happened in U.S. political history, actually almost ever, since the real populist movement, the radical farmers movement, was crushed by force. Here's the spectrum of discussion has been substantially shifted. Things that were not on the agenda not long ago are front and center. Universal health care, amplified by the pandemic disaster, Green New Deal, the result of serious activism by a small group of young people who occupied congressional offices. In the background was the Sanders success. Young members of Congress who swept into power were able to support them. Now that's on the agenda, issue after issue. Sanders has made the tactical decision, which some criticize, but I think is correct, to join the Biden campaign and push it to the left. His associates are working on planning commissions. And in fact, if you look at the program that's emerged, it's farther to the left than anything since FDR. Offers lots of opportunities. Now, this didn't happen by magic. It happens kind of like the Green New Deal, happened by constant pressure and activism. That's the way the left ought to conceive of elections. Pushing the button is not the issue. It's the constant activism that is reshaping the array of choices, issues, and policies. And you don't win by snapping your fingers. Some things work, some things fail, then you pick up and you go on from there. And I think we've seen significant changes over the years.
I think the title of tonight's episode might be "You Don't Win by Snapping Your Fingers," which is unfortunate, if only it were so. But we'll get back to the election in a bit. I do want your thoughts on 2020. But two other things I want to cover with you. First is something of a kind of new outbreak of a debate over speech and the left. And it's written by, there was a very, I think, in fact, a very good but very provocative Matt Taibbi article dealing with this. But more broadly, beyond that sort of particular controversy, again, I think he wrote a very good piece. But I think that, and I want, and correct me if I'm wrong, I want to connect this with perhaps some of your work around manufacturing consent and a sort of substantive view of freedom of speech, because it seems to me right now that one, it's sort of fallen out of favor amongst some on the left. And I actually think more ominously, I prefer to just have that actual debate with people. But some have sort of reverted to a very narrow libertarian position, which is that if the state isn't mandating something, then it's not an issue. So then we don't have to worry about, as an example, media monopolies or openness on tech platforms, as an example. Of course, you can hold up these atrocious examples of all sorts of obscene and bigoted people taking advantage of these platforms. But at the same time, we know that the sort of overall arc of sort of controlling these things will have implications for, as an example, investigating U.S. foreign policy or something like that. So anyways, I'm giving you a lot of a preamble here, but I'd like your thoughts on how you relate to the question of speech, and in fact, even when it's quite controversial, and why you hold it, I guess, as both a political and moral principle, if I read you correctly.
First of all, we should think a little bit, as you pointed out before, about the history. Why is this issue arising now? Is it new? It's the norm for decades, but it was always targeted against the left, so nobody paid attention to it. Way beyond anything that's happening now.
Right.
I mean, I'll just give you personal experiences. Others have far worse ones. Meetings broken up, violently disrupted, talks canceled, books destroyed. So, for example, the first book that you mentioned, Manufacturing Consent, first book that Ed Herman and I wrote together was early 70s. The book was published by a very successful publisher. 20,000 copies were printed. The publisher was owned by a big major corporation, mega corporation. And one of the executives in the corporation saw the ads and didn't like it and wanted to look at the book, was horrified, and demanded that the publisher withdraw it from publication. And when they refused, he destroyed the entire publisher, put all of its books, all of its stock was destroyed, all the books, to prevent it from distributing a book of ours. Did anybody care? Out of curiosity, I brought it to the attention of leading civil libertarians like Nat Hentoff and the ACLU, but they didn't see any problem. It's not state censorship. If a corporation decides to destroy a publisher and destroy all its stock to keep some book from appearing, what's wrong with that? In fact, it was hard to find. Ben Bakdickian was about the one person who found something wrong with this. But that's not the only time. I could give you other cases of mine where books were withdrawn from publication and I was asked to return the advance because it had some political content that the publisher didn't like. Other people have been fired, faculty positions eliminated, and so on. Nobody cared. That wasn't censorship. It was directed against the left, vastly beyond anything that's going on today. Now, that doesn't justify what's going on today. First of all, I really wouldn't call it the left. So when the New York Times withdraws an op-ed, which I don't think they should have done, it's pretty hard to call that the left. When a lot of young people decide to deplatform some speaker, I think they're making a bad mistake, even from a tactical point of view. There are much better ways to deal with it. Like you can run a counter session where you expose what's going on and use it as an educational opportunity. A lot of things can be done. So I think it's wrong in principle, and it's tactically wrong. Like it's a gift to the far right. They love it. But
and the platforms.
But we should bear in mind that it's a very small part of what has been the norm for as long back as you want to go. It's now targeting people who are considered respectable in the mainstream, so it's a problem. But we should be quite aware of what's going on. But yes, it's the wrong thing to do, and we should try to stop it.
And thank you. And really just underlying that delineation that just because it's happening in the private sector does not mean that it's not an enormous threat. Particularly to the left, obviously. One of the many pieces of activism that I've appreciated immensely that you've been involved with, was advocating for President Lula when he was a political prisoner. You visited him when he was in prison in Curitiba. I had the honor of going and interviewing him with the journalist from Brazil Wire, who's reporting on exposing the truth of that case. Even before the Intercept leaks, they laid the intellectual groundwork for understanding that case. And we were honored to cover it significantly on this show, and including using clips of yours explaining the situation. Can you tell us why you think President Lula is such a particularly important leader? And I mean, the situation obviously continues even more dire today with Corona. Can you reflect on that a bit?
Well, President Lula came from a working-class background. He was a union activist during the dictatorship, latter days of the dictatorship, succeeded in organizing significant opposition, ran for president. He had his victory stolen a couple of times, but he finally won the presidency, initiated a new era in Brazilian history. You don't have to take my word for it. You take the word of World Bank, not a radical institution. In 2016, a couple of years after the end of his term, they published a long study of recent Brazilian economic history. They called Lula's term in office the golden decade of Brazilian economic history. Enormous reduction of poverty, a tremendous increase in inclusion, large parts of the population, blacks and Indians, totally marginalized and repressed, brought into it policies to give people some control over their lives. Tremendous success. A couple of years after he left office, there was a fall in commodity prices, and many argue that it was just the high commodity prices that he was based his successes on. The World Bank disagrees. They say with the right policies, it could hold and continue after the commodity fall. At the same time, Brazil became one of the most respected countries in the world, if not the most respected. You take a look now, it's an absolute pariah, one of the most ridiculed and condemned countries in the world. It's a big shift. Well, there were plenty of problems with Lula's term, I should say. One of them was he tolerated corruption much too readily, didn't pay attention to it. And there was a lot of it in the Workers' Party. That's endemic not only in Brazil, but in the entire region. And here, I should say, we often don't call it corruption, we call it legal. But there's plenty of just plain, straight corruption. But so he did tolerate. The thing this administration really failed to do was to get people to understand that they were part of the system that was developing. So in fact, now it's quite striking. I've seen this in visiting Brazil. You probably have too, in polls and so on. When people are asked, people who benefited greatly from the Lula's programs, Bolsa Familia and others, people who talk to people, they were very poor families. They were able to buy a car, kid could go to college and start a small business. When you ask them, how did this happen? They say it came from God. Or it was an accident. They don't know that it was part of the Workers' Party programs. And that was a real failure of engagement. It just sort of came to them somehow. They were not part of it. That was a big failure. And there are other things you can criticize. But the judgment about the golden decade, I think, is quite right. And the rise of Brazil to a position of great international respect as a voice of the global South was extremely significant. And part of the reason for his downfall, the power systems don't like that. Upstarts are not supposed to do that. Let's take one case. Brazil, along with Turkey, negotiated a deal with Iran, which could have completely ended the crisis. Obama and Clinton came down on them like a ton of bricks. This is our business, not your business. Got to it. I won't go into the details, but that's a general reaction. Inside Brazil, it's rather similar. The elites in Brazil are extremely racist and class conscious. And here's this guy who comes from a working class background, doesn't even speak proper Portuguese, didn't go to the right schools. He's supposed to be humble, grateful for what we do for him, not up there setting policy. You talk to people, you can just sense the bitterness and anger just for these reasons, quite apart from the policies, even more than the policies. Anyhow, a couple of years after he was out of office, a soft coup was initiated. Don't go through the details, but it finally led to the October 2018 election. Lula was jailed. He was the most popular candidate, very likely to win. He was jailed on very dubious charges, but he was also silenced, not just jailed, which tells you what was going on. Unlike a mass murderer on death row, he was not permitted to make a statement. That was very important. He kept quiet during the electoral campaign. Now he's out on sort of partial release while the appeals are going on. But before the election, keep him out. And what came in was an ultra-right fanatic who's destroying Brazil. I mean, the country right now is just about on the verge of a military coup. I don't know if you saw the clips from a couple of days ago where the Bolsonaro gangs were attacking the parliamentary building, the Supreme Court, and saying, get rid of it. They're blocking our hero, the executive, Bolsonaro, fired the heads of the investigative divisions, which were looking into his family. The statement was, nobody's going to fuck around with my family.
Right.
Actually, it's pretty similar to what just happened here. Very similar. Bolsonaro sees himself as a kind of clone of Trump, tragedy and farce next to each other. And what Trump just did is very similar. He just fired all the inspectors general who were put into place to monitor corruption and malfeasance in executive offices. They were beginning to inquire into this fetid swamp that he's created in Washington. So he fired them all. And he went, like any tin pot dictator, went out of his way to humiliate the senior Republican senator, Charles Grassley, who'd spent his career setting this system in implementation. Not a peep from the Republican Party. They've disappeared as a party. And it's worse than the old Communist Party. The leader gives an order, we creep on our knees and bless him. Nothing like this in political history.
Could I... Hey, folks. First half of a great conversation with Professor Noam Chomsky. We're going to play the second half in the post game for patrons. I love it. I absolutely agree with him on the speech question. We were potentially going to talk about the Taibbi essay, which people should read in the post game, and you could whatever. There's things to sort of nitpick about here and there, which I have some like I had some disagreements about the Times part or whatever. But the overall part about the strategic reasons for a serious substantive commitment to freedom of speech and not accepting the terms. I mean, that is really the sort of very disturbing to me. The idea that after decades of seeing, both literal public suppression, we'll talk about Eugene Debs in the post game, literally being a political prisoner of the U.S. imperial machine. There's a reason socialists were involved in creating the ACLU. But also in the examples that Chomsky pointed out, totally in the private domain. I think across the board, whether we're talking about bureaucracy, where there's some myth and lie that bureaucracy is purely the product of the public sector, not the private one. We have to have substantive commitments in all these domains. So I like Noam Chomsky's insight and clarity on that issue. And of course, many other things. In the second half of the interview, he's going to talk about how despicable and dangerous and grotesque Trump is. Not something to shrug your shoulders at. Like, there's the conversation has gotten so stuck, I think, between, people that are absolutely rightly, they understand why Trump is appealing in some ways. They understand the humor, whatever, what he tapped into in 2016, and they want to be real about it for purposes of beating him. And they're repulsed by the embarrassing, ridiculous, cable news, Democratic Party, #resistance, and all of these people that, we criticize endlessly. And at the same time, and we've talked about it on this show, ripping up the global arms control infrastructure. That's significant. The fact that, he does, in fact, feed and foment every form of bigotry, discrimination, and brutalism. And also the fact that this right-wing populism thing is bullshit, as evidenced by, as an example, the Tyson food and meatpacking thing we were talking about in the beginning. And so, we definitely talk about other things, but I would say that even in the Trump stuff, the way he fits it together, actually a very good and substantive synthesis of a systemic and radical left critique, which of course automatically makes the conversation about neoliberalism and capitalism and these broader historical forces, which he of course talks about, but also, in fact, these specific tensions of our moment, that just because, we got to be very careful of the tendency that just because people that might be, wrong about other things or annoying or just miss a whole hell of a lot, it doesn't mean that they're wrong about, it's firing the inspector generals, as an example. Like, that's actually a very solid, very clear point that he just articulated there. That's relevant.
Noam gives Trump a superlative label in this this next part, and I think he justifies it very well in a way that I think when people try to balance the scales too much and say the GOP and the Democrats are the same thing, which I know why people say that. Obviously, we all know why, the very real reasons for saying that. But it's also, I think, kind of psychologically nice to think that Trump isn't as horrible and world-threatening as he is. His administration broadly, again, Noam's not just talking about Trump, the Cheeto, right? But I think it is important to keep that in mind.
Absolutely. And he does it very well and very ably. So, folks, and of course, we're talking with Daniel Bessner about the Pentagon, Hollywood, and policing. We've got a bunch of stories to get to from AMLO, with an extraordinary courage in terms of getting fuel shipments to Venezuela under siege by the United States, the tensions that threaten the whole planet. I'm telling you, watch the dynamic between China and India in this border region, especially in the context of ratcheted tensions with Pakistan, the stripping of the Indian constitution, and heightened waves of brutalism you see from the BJP government in Kashmir, and a much more assertive China. I mean, this is another aspect of things we'll have to watch. So we have a ton of stories to get to. Guys, you make it all possible, so join us and let's keep growing and doing this great work. We appreciate everybody. And patreon.com/TMBS. Come watch the second half of the Chomsky interview with us. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. We will see you in the postgame.